The argument by definition is a general method of arguing, although our focus, of course, will be how to use it in the context of ethics. So, a common way to argue is to argue that something belongs to a class of things because it fits a definition for that class. So, might argue, for example, in the case of thinking of ethics, we often focus on questions of like what is a person to address the ethics of personhood. So you might argue that an entity has the qualities of being a person and hence gets the moral benefits of being a person. And various other ways to do this as well. But in all cases, whether you're doing it in ethics, aesthetics, or law or whatever, the goal is to show that the thing in question meets the definition being presented. And of course, you also have to develop a good definition and probably defend that definition if it's non-standard as well. Definitions are often set within theories. In the context of ethics, moral theories will define essential terms. For example, if a moral theory is talking about people, it'll define what it is to be a person. If it's talking obviously about good and evil, it'll define those as well. This method is often used as part of an extended argument, an argument in which consists of, the sense, multiple arguments. You argue to establish one claim as a conclusion, and then use that claim establishes a conclusion in one argument as a premise in another, and keep expanding on that. So, for example, a person might present an argument by definition trying to show that some entity is a person. For example, people have been arguing that, say, whales or even forests or rivers could be people in a legal sense, but in our concern is with a moral sense. And then once it's established or argued that, say, whales can be considered morally people, then you can make another argument in terms of how they should be treated as people. So the method essentially has 4 steps. The first step is to present a definition for a class of things. For example, what is the definition of a person? If you're trying to argue that an entity falls under being a person. Or if you're arguing about aesthetics, the question might be, what is the definition of art? Or in the case of other things in philosophy, you might try to define like what is it to be time or space or any such thing. Then the second step is to describe the relevant qualities of what you're going to claim meets or doesn't meet that definition. And then, for example, if a person is trying to argue that, say, a whale should be considered, or certain types of whales should be considered people, they would try to show the qualities of a whale that would qualify it for being a person. And then the next step is, to show how these qualities make that entity, meet, or if you're arguing against it, fail to meet that definition. And then you conclude that either the entity in question belongs to that class, or if you're trying to argue that it doesn't, that it obviously does not. And so, for example, with the whale example, a person, present a definition of what it is to be a person, describe the qualities of whales, typically things like their degree of intelligence, their ability to feel, that they're social creatures, etc. And then show how that meets the definition of being a person, and conclude that, for example, that whales are people. And if someone's taking the opposite view, they would say people have the certain qualities, describe whales, show that whales don't meet the definition of person, and conclude that whales should not be considered people. So in terms of templates for it, again, essentially you'd be doing one of two things. Either using an argument by definition to say that something belongs within the class of the things is defined, or the opposite being that it doesn't belong there. With the variables and logic keys, the layout would be this. The first premise, you would say that under definition D, to belong to the class of A things, requires properties P, Q, and R. And so the definition D would be the definition, whatever it is that you give. And obviously D is just a variable for whatever definition. And the class of A things, A would also be a variable for whatever things you're talking about. Say people, art, whatever. And then P, Q, and R are variables as well, with the qualities that you're requiring to meet that definition. And P, Q, and R are used because that's pretty standard in you're doing philosophy stuff to say that there are these, whatever these variables stand for. And need not be, you wouldn't always exactly be 3. You'd want to probably have, more than 3, but it could be any number. It's just P, Q, and R are just like stand-ins for whatever properties you're talking about. So if you were, have a definition of person, it would tend to be fairly complicated. You'd probably have quite a few, if you're using Locke's definition, there'd be quite a bit of stuff going on there. Second premise would be that X, which would be a particular thing, has those qualities, whatever they might be. So if you're arguing about personhood, you'd have the properties that would be required to be a person, and then you show the entity you're talking about, say a whale or fetus or an AI system or a robot, whatever you're arguing about, has those qualities, and then conclude that it meets that definition and then therefore belongs within that class. So if you're doing like some AI ethics, you might argue about the qualities that it takes to be a person, and then consider the qualities that a hypothetical AI would need to have to be, to meet those conditions, and then argue that if it did meet those conditions, it would have to be considered a person. The alternative approach, of course, is to argue for exclusion, where instead of arguing that, say, a whale could be a person, or a fetus, should be considered a person, or that a hypothetical AI should be considered a person, you'd do the opposite. You'd argue that it shouldn't be considered a member of that, class of things. That a whale shouldn't be a person, or a fetus shouldn't be considered a person, or hypothetical AI shouldn't be a person, or whatever you're arguing for. So the approach is, kind of similar, it's just reversed. So you begin with premise 1, under definition D, whatever your definition is, to belong in the class of A things, whatever class of things you're talking about, requires the properties P, Q, and R, whatever those variables stand for. You would argue, show that the thing you're talking about lacks the qualities P, Q, or R, then conclude because of this, it doesn't meet that definition, and therefore would follow that it doesn't belong in that class of things. So if you disagreed about whales being people, you would come up with a definition and properties that would exclude whales, show the whales lack those relevant qualities, and then infer that whales should not be considered people. So that's the template for arguing. So again, I've given some common examples, quite a few debates in ethics, as the examples indicate, do involve those kinds of debates. One example is, of course, the ongoing moral debate about abortion. Many, but not all of the moral debates about abortion involve issues of personhood. So that approach would be to define a person as having certain qualities, and then argue that a fetus or embryo or zygote, or at the moment of conception, whatever your view is, that it either has those qualities that make it a person, or the alternative, of course, is that it lacks those qualities that make it a person, and then draw the appropriate conclusion that the zygote is or is not a person. In the case of outside of ethics, you can also use this in aesthetics. Not surprisingly, aesthetics and ethics, have a lot in common. Ethics is about good and evil. Aesthetics is about art and beauty, good art, bad art. So debates about, genre are often battles over arguments by definition. So, for example, you might be wondering whether a work is a work of horror or a work of suspense. And you define a work of horror a certain way, and then have a work and say, well, this work should be considered horror because it meets the definition, or alternatively, that it should not be considered horror. You could also, in the context of aesthetics, argue similar things about whether something belongs in a particular genre of music, or pretty much anything like that. And arguments by definition, of course, can be used outside of philosophy. Legal definitions often involve this, of course. You try to argue that something falls under a particular definition as set by, say, a contract or a law, and there would be a battle about whether it falls under it or not. For example, a debate over what counts as, say, small business, as opposed to a not small business, etc. Now, since an argument by definition involves definitions, and dictionaries are full of definitions by definition, it's not surprising that people would often turn to the dictionary to give an argument by definition and reference the dictionary, either like the classics, like Webster's dictionary, or online dictionaries. Now, that can be a reasonable starting place, but one thing about dictionaries, of course, is that they're not, handed down by divine celestial beings with accurate definitions that are objective and perfect. They're obviously just created and made up by people. And they pretty much present to us whatever the editors of the work, people, creating it, regard as correct, acceptable, or more likely, generally used definitions. And dictionaries typically do not purport to exist to solve substantial, philosophical, legal, debates. And they generally, of course, you won't see a standard dictionary backing up their definitions with arguments. And the definitions tend to be pretty general and quite neutral. So you wouldn't be able to settle a debate over, say, the ethics of abortion, or debate about, what genre a particular work falls in, and just by picking up a dictionary and, pointing to a definition. So a dictionary can be a good starting point. Or if you're making a case, you could make an argument that's based on, say, common usage or an appeal to intuition, in which case the dictionary should be useful. But in general, the dictionary is not going to solve substantial moral disputes over complex things like goodness, evil, personhood, etc. So when making an argument by definition, a critical thing, of course, is to have a good definition. Because if the definition in an argument by definition is defective, the argument itself is going to obviously inherit that problem. That definition is going to be bad, so building an argument based on a bad definition will be a bad argument. And this raises the question of, how do you tell when a definition is good, bad, or ugly? So, broadly speaking, and this is outside of ethics and philosophy, etc., these are standards for good definitions. So, in terms of what a good definition should be, some things, in a way are kind of obvious. A good definition should be clear as opposed to lacking in clarity. Although, of course, a definition could be quite, complex. A definition needs to be plausible. It also needs to be internally consistent. If the definition is inconsistent with itself or even contradictory, obviously it's going to have defects, as we saw with the notion of logical consistency. If a definition is inconsistent or contradicts itself, parts of the definition can't possibly be right. You might not know which parts are flawed, but it's got to have defects. There's also the common assumption that a good definition needs to correspond to our intuitions. And we'll see more of intuitions when we talk about the argument from intuition. Or more, which is probably better than just matching our intuitions, it's got to be supported by arguments. So if you have a definition that seems, plausible and intuitively appealing, then those are pluses in its favor, should have those qualities. But of course, there can be definitions that we regard as not intuitive, but in those cases, you need to back up the definition with reasons why people should accept that, even though it's, say counterintuitive. And as we'll see, what counts as intuitive or not intuitive depends a lot on the context, on the individual. So in terms of definitions going, bad, definitions should not be circular. Like they shouldn't just run in a circle, because then the definition, in a sense, just restates itself. So if we try to define goodness as the quality of being good, or define person as someone who has the qualities of being a person, those are true, but they don't really help us. Like if someone says a person is something with the qualities of being a person, true, but how do we tell what a person is? Or if someone says a work of art is a creation or product of the fine arts, well, that doesn't help us because we don't know what arts are. Now, some of the classic defects in definitions going way back, and this is something you'll see in pretty much every critical thinking or basic logic book, is a definition being, too narrow. And there's also the problem of being too broad. So a definition that's too narrow exclude things that should be included. And of course, you can get into a debate about what should be in there. And a definition that's too broad, you might guess, lets things in that should not be included. So a definition, the metaphor that I heard, centuries ago when I took my first logic class, was like a doorkeeper at a, or bouncer at an exclusive club. The idea is that the doorkeeper, the bouncer, is supposed to only let people in who should be in and leave out people who shouldn't be. But of course, they shouldn't keep out people who should be allowed in the club. So good definitions like that lets in what should be in there, keeps out what shouldn't. Or another example would be like the security on your phone. You want it to work so you can get in, and you want it to work so other people you don't want getting in can't get in. So a definition that's too narrow, again, is it's leaving out too much. For example, if we define a person as a human being, that's probably too narrow, because even though, of course, as far as we know, humans are the only intelligent species we know about so far, but it makes sense that there could be non-humans that are people. Again, this is science fiction, but in science fiction, you have Vulcans and Asgardians and Andorians and all the peoples of Star Wars. And even again, these are all fictional, but we can imagine there being real aliens, and we would probably be inclined to think, hey, there'd be people. And we also don't want to assume that non-humans can't be people, because we're working hard to build our replacements, robots and AI, and we don't want to just assume that they can't be people. That's it. Now, this, of course, whether it's too narrow or too broad, could be debated. A person could argue that humans are people and only humans are people. Another example, if we defined art as just paintings and sculpture, that would leave out music and poetry and other forms of writing, so that would be too narrow. So a definition that's too narrow leaves out too much. A definition that's too broad includes things that should be left out. For example, if someone defines art as anything that creates or influences the emotions, that would be too broad, because, for example, if someone says, hey, here's $1,000 free, and get whatever you want, you'd probably have some emotions. Or if someone posts some mean things about you, in social media, or, mocks one of your comments, and that would cause an emotional response, but that wouldn't be art. Or there's a kind of extreme example, if someone punches someone in the face, that's going to create, emotions, but we wouldn't say that would be a form of art, except perhaps a martial art. While it may seem odd, a definition could be both too narrow and too broad, letting in too much and also keeping out too much. So For example, the definition, if we wanted to define person as a being with human genetics, or an entity with, something that has human genes, that would exclude all non-humans, but it would also include things potentially like, cancer, or just random, skin cells, because they would have human genes, from a human, but it wouldn't say, for example, that, cancer cells that have been removed are people. That would be too broad. Now, definitions can also be too vague, and typically when a definition is like too vague, that means it's not precise enough. They're also typically too broad. Definitions can also be ambiguous, and ambiguity means that there are two or more meanings and it's not clear what is intended. In that case, if someone gives an ambiguous definition, you wouldn't know what they mean. And that would be a defect in the presentation of the definition. So a definition needs to avoid being circular, avoid being too narrow, avoid being too broad, avoid being both too narrow and too broad, also avoid being too vague or ambiguous or otherwise being defective. So what if someone makes an argument by definition and you want to reply to it, or you are replying to an argument by definition yourself? For example, in the paper, you present an argument and then you raise an objection, reply back to it. So here's how the objection reply would go for an argument by definition. So there are essentially three ways to go after an argument by definition, focusing on, the argument itself. So the first thing is to attack the definition. So a definition can be criticized by showing how it fails to meet the standards of a good definition. So you try to show, for example, that it's too narrow, too broad, vague, ambiguous, circular, or otherwise defective in some manner. So if the definition is bad, then that undercuts the argument. So, for example, suppose a person is arguing that a tragedy is a work of art that creates strong emotions. Now, obviously, of course, that's, too broad, because there are many works that create strong emotions that wouldn't be tragic. They could be, say, a comedy creating, or a horror movie would also create strong emotions, but of fear. As another example, if someone argues that stealing is to take possession of something you do not have legal ownership of, that you do not have legal title to, that would be too broad, because there are things that someone doesn't have legal title to that wouldn't be stealing. For example, to use a silly example, breathing. We're taking possession of air, but we don't legally, contractually own air, but that's not stealing. So one option, again, is criticizing the definition, showing that there's something wrong with the definition. And of course, the way to respond back to that is to criticize the criticism by trying to show the original definition is not flawed in that manner, or showing that the criticisms are defective in some other way. The next option is attacking what is said to fit under that definition, the X. So if what is being talked about you can show it doesn't actually meet the definition, then the argument would fail. So, for example, if someone is having a debate over genres of music and they contend that a particular song is a country song and not, say, like a Western song or like a, pop song or something, but if it's shown that even given their definition of what a country song is, that it doesn't have those qualities, it doesn't meet that definition, in that case, of course, the argument would fail. So if the definition of country song is such that this song doesn't fit it, and you show that, the argument would fail. Or another example, if someone argues that dolphins are people based on certain qualities, but then it's shown that their people are wrong about those qualities, then they wouldn't be people. Now, to give a concrete example, one thing that people sometimes do to argue that, what it is to be a person is, for example, our good dead friend Descartes focuses on language, true language use, as proof of the presence of a mind. Not as like making noises, etc. Interestingly, as we'll see, Descartes anticipated basically like talking machines that did not think. So if it's claimed that, say, dolphins are people because they talk, but it's shown that they don't actually talk. I mean, they do make, complex noises, etc. But a person could make the case that they don't actually have true language. And if that's shown, then they would not meet that definition of people. And of course, this could be argued. A person could counter that saying they in fact do have this language capability, and the battle could go on. A third option is what's called counter definition. And in a counter definition, what you would do is, not surprisingly, present an alternative definition to the original definition. So you're often using an argument by definition to counter the argument by definition. So the objective would be to show that the counter definition is a better definition. And therefore, the old definition or the previous definition should be rejected. And presumably the intent of this is to, attack the original argument. And usually, so the counter argument is usually designed to show that the original argument, would thus fail. You could, of course, respond like in a non-attack way, saying, here, let me help you with this definition. Here's a better definition. Your argument is better. So you could use a counter definition to help the original argument. Now, of course, the new definition, the counter definition, is subject to all the same assessment. Is it, a good argument? I mean, it's a good definition. Is it a bad definition, etc. And so the counter to the counter is, of course, another counter or an assessment of the definition. And this fight over definitions could go on quite a while. And not surprisingly, many moral debates are over definitions of key things like what is person, what is cheating, what is stealing, what is privacy, etc. So, as an example, if there's a debate about like, is this a work of horror? A person might come up with like what they think is a better definition. Or if there's a debate about, whether whales are people, a person might start off with a definition, and a counter definition would be presented as being a better definition of person. And the fight goes on. So that's a look at the argument by definition, with quite an extensive look at what is a good definition versus what is a bad definition. So that takes us to the end of argument by definition. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.